These are the fields of northern France, in many ways unchanged since the Middle Ages. Imagine with me living in France 700 years ago and setting off on a pilgrimage to perhaps the most famous place of worship in the world, Chartres Cathedral. All day long it draws you toward it, growing larger and larger, still looming in the distance like a vision. Overcome with emotion, you are certain that this must be the most splendid place on earth. This must truly be the palace of God. Just as it must have been in the 12th century, Chartres remains an incredible sight. Chartres was built by people very similar to those of Beaulieu, and although the story of Beaulieu is made up, it is based on many of the cathedrals we'll be seeing. Even to our modern eyes, which have seen towering skyscrapers, indoor stadiums, jumbo jets, and space shuttles, the Gothic cathedrals still inspire awe. There's no other word for it. They are so enormous and so obviously dangerous and expensive to construct that we have to ask, how were they built?
Yes, and why? Because though they are marvelous of engineering, that alone doesn't tell us the story about Gothic cathedrals. One of the things that makes them different from castles and pyramids and ancient Roman cities is that after 700 years, the great Gothic cathedrals are still in use.
And for their original purpose.
Cathedrals have always functioned as parish churches for local inhabitants. But they were also much more. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning the throne of the bishop. And most cathedrals are still the bishop's churches, the administrative centers of their diocese, and the spiritual centers for entire regions. Places large enough to hold the many thousands who still visit them every year.
Aside from being a spiritual center, the cathedral became the focus of city life. Not only did it symbolize prosperity and civic pride, it also served as a magnet for trade and commerce. Its images found their way onto stained glass, coins, seals, and all manner of medieval souvenirs, much like today.
If you lived in the Middle Ages, almost since birth you would have been taught that God was the most important force in your life, and that everything around you, the change of seasons, the sun and the rain, the sowing and reaping of your crops, even war and famine and untimely death, all of this was merely the working out of God's plan. Heaven and hell were real, just as real and literal as the wind and the cold, the fields and the animals. Religious faith was the dominant motivating factor behind everything. The church brought you into the world, and it took you out of this world and into the next. Between baptism and last rites, you depended upon the church for education and religious instruction, for confession, absolution, and communion, for keeping legal documents such as wills and marriage contracts, and for help and support when you needed it. Down through the centuries, the cathedrals are where people have celebrated their own lives and remembered the lives of others. And the building of each cathedral was a saga of struggle and ingenuity. of heroes and villains, bishops and kings, and people who in many ways were like each of us.
We're in the Royal Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, just a few miles from the center of Paris. This is the royal burial place of French kings and one of the most important religious centers in all of France. This is also where the Gothic style began. Saint-Denis was the passion of its greatest abbot, Suger, who was born in 1081 and became one of the most influential clerics and statesmen of his time. It was his dream to build a church where worshippers could actually feel the presence of God. And to Suger, God's presence meant light. Here in the choir of Saint-Denis, Suger brought God's light into the church. Suger didn't invent the stained glass window. He simply used it on a scale previously unknown. This entire area is virtually enclosed by a beautiful curtain of glass. The choir, the ambulatory passage which allowed movement around the choir, these elegant radiating chapels are all part of Suger's vision. And this unity of design and structure became the essence of Gothic architecture. Compare Saint-Denis to the Romanesque churches of the time. We see heavy, castle-like structures with small windows and massive walls. Next to these buildings, Suger's church, with its delicate, light, glass-filled walls, must have seemed a miracle. For as Pierre asked, how could such a building be supported by walls of glass? Well, the answer is, it couldn't. What traditionally supports a roof and ceiling are walls. In the earliest churches, these walls gradually evolved into a series of arches and load-bearing columns called piers. As wooden ceilings were replaced by more permanent, fireproof, and significantly heavier stone ceilings called vaults, the walls had to be thicker to support the increased weight and resist the outward thrust. The windows remained quite small. In later buildings, the downward weight and outward thrust of the vaulting was concentrated at a number of specific points. By making the arches wider and the piers heavier, more of the wall space could be opened up for windows. As church buildings grew taller and closer to the heavens, the weight of the vaulting inside and the force of the wind outside increased. At some point, the piers would have become so huge that the space between them would have become virtually unusable. So, to reduce the size of the main piers and to effectively resist the force of the wind, additional support, placed out of the interior space, was needed. The result was a row of buttresses, connected to the high walls by stone arms, called flying buttresses. We're up among the flying buttresses at Amiens, one of the tallest cathedrals in the world. The thrust of the interior vaulting pushes against the wall high above each of the main piers. It then passes through the wall, travels across the flying buttress, and is channeled through the main buttress into the foundations below. The result of this is a wide, unobstructed aisle below me and this magnificent wall of glass behind me. Initially, Gothic builders weren't entirely sure about their new breakthrough. Chartres, one of the first of the giant cathedrals, was begun in 1194. It has massive buttresses, each weighing over 2 million pounds. The flying buttresses, on the other hand, are rather timid. The builders of Chartres were taking no chances. At Bourges, built almost as early as Chartres, we see long, delicate flying buttresses that much more gracefully support a building of comparable size. Far less light is blocked by structure. Each buttress weighs only a third as much as those at Chartres, an important factor not only in the appearance of the building, but also in its cost. Moving stone from great distances, hauling it to the site, and then lifting it to these extraordinary heights meant that economy in design was essential. It was possible, however, to take that economy a little too far. In 1284, there was a collapse at the just completed cathedral at Beauvais, after the nave had reached a height of 150 feet. The transept and choir are all that remain. But for the most part, the medieval builder was extremely careful and knowledgeable. He used his own building as a model, checking each part as it was finished. An example of the builder's knowledge is to be found in the use of ornate stone pinnacles like these here at Amiens. For centuries, people thought they were merely decorative, but as it turns out, their weight helps the buttresses to do their jobs more effectively. The cathedral was meant to be a physical representation of the divine order of things, a microcosm of a universe fashioned by God, the ultimate master builder. Nowhere is this better seen than in the perfect proportions of the west facade of Notre Dame in Paris. In all its magnificence, Notre Dame was a fitting symbol for an influential and flourishing city, the intellectual center of the medieval world. The order and imposing presence of this building also echoed the harmony and stability which in the 12th century began to spread throughout the entire country. By the 13th century, the alliance of a powerful monarchy, working hand in glove with an equally powerful clergy, had helped to bring peace, prosperity, and learning to all of France. Notre Dame came to symbolize an entire age.
The Gothic cathedral was a kind of miracle, the tangible result of 2 centuries of economic growth and prosperity, especially in the cities. By the 13th century, the cities became magnets for farmers bringing their new surpluses, for traders eager to buy and sell, and for a new international merchant class who worked from warehouses and docks along the waterways like this one here at Amiens. The medieval city provided excitement, opportunity, and freedom. As the cities grew, they competed with each other for trade and business, just as cities do today. International traders, cloth merchants, and grain dealers mingled with the faithful outside the house of God. One of the things that attracted people and encouraged them to come from far away, bringing their money with them, was the relics. In most cases, the greater the cathedral, the greater and more powerful the relics it contained. This is said to be the head of St. John the Baptist, kept among the treasures at Amiens. It was brought back to France by the Crusaders, who scoured the Holy Land for relics such as this. The relics and the miracles they could produce were considered so important in the Middle Ages that King Louis IX paid a fortune for what he believed to be Christ's authentic crown of thorns. There is more than a little dispute about whether it actually was. There were several crowns of thorns making their way through Europe at that time, all equally well authenticated. So there was a strong connection between a cathedral's drawing power and its town's wealth. A definite link between business and religion. For example, the town docks at Amiens were jointly owned by the merchants and the cathedral chapter. A town's relation to its bishop could often be strained. In 1112, the citizens here in Laon were so unhappy with their cruel and cynical Bishop Gaudry that they bought a communal charter from the king to separate themselves from him. When Gaudry got back to town, he paid the king even more to annul the charter, leading to considerable unrest. Gaudry's soldiers murdered the leader of the townsmen in cold blood. So the outraged citizens marched right into this palace, dragged the bishop out, cut his head off, and set fire to the cathedral and to the palace. The new bishop had to send the local relics on tour twice, just to pay for repairs. Financing a cathedral was hardly ever an easy task, even in the pious Middle Ages. 100 years after Laon, the people of Reims rose in bloody revolt against heavy taxation and halted construction for years. In fact, peasants all over France who could least afford it were often made to bear the heaviest financial burden. Construction taxes forced many peasants to borrow from city merchants and moneylenders, who themselves would profit handsomely again once the cathedral was completed.
Ironically, the local parish churches sometimes suffered most of all, as they had to stop their own building projects and repairs and pledge large sums of money to the cathedral fund. Each cathedral had its own story, and there was a darker side to many of them, including, as we'll see, Beaulieu.
This is the tombstone of Uly Berger, the architect and master builder of Saint-Nicaise here in Reims. He's holding a model of the church, and around him are the implements he used in overseeing its construction: a measuring stick, a pair of calipers, and a square. These were just about the only tools a medieval builder like our Guillaume de Senlis would have had to supervise the building of a structure like this. What he lacked in technology, the medieval builder had to make up in ingenuity and personal skill. Not only did he have to be able to read and write, but he also needed a keen understanding of applied geometry, substantial knowledge of the existing buildings of his time, and as if this weren't enough, he also had to be able to manage the multitude of workers required for such an undertaking. There were as many as 50 individual sculptors working at Amiens, and considerably more than that here at Reims. The organization and planning must have been nothing less than incredible. The most important craftsmen were the stonemasons. They were divided into the rough masons who cut, mortared, and laid the heavy stone, and the freemasons who carved and laid the more intricate stonework, such as the ribbing, the tracery, and all the ornamentation. All the masons served a long and rigorous apprenticeship. They were highly organized and mobile, traveling from town to town wherever there was work. Now under the masons served the quarrymen, the mortar mixers, and the carriers, which often included oxen. Those animals were considered so important here at Laon, by the way, that they were immortalized in stone in the towers. None of the menial laborers were treated as well as the masons, and none were paid much for their work, particularly the oxen. At one cathedral whose records still survive, workers began in the summer before 5 a.m. and continued on until 7 or 8 in the evening, a 14 or 15-hour day, with a half hour for breakfast, 1.5 hours for lunch and a short nap, they must have needed it by then, and a half hour for a late afternoon snack. In the winter, the people who managed not to be laid off only worked a 9-hour day. Around every cathedral, virtually all labor was skilled, to some degree, as well as professional and organized. There's the story of the cult of the carts from Chartres, where noble citizens were supposed to have hitched themselves to wagons to help transport building materials. It's very romantic and very moving, but very doubtful. Many other tales have come down to us about amateurs so inspired by the undertaking that they were willing to work for free. In fact, there's an epic song of the period about a pious local man who worked entirely for love, wouldn't accept any money for his labors. The other workers killed him. And there's plenty of opportunity for that at a place like this. Money for the construction project was handled by the cathedral's chapter. Here at Amiens, the chapter house actually adjoins the cathedral. The chapter hired the master builder, dispensed the payroll, kept the records, and bought materials. They appointed one of their own to be custos fabricae, or keeper of the fabric, to personally administer all these tasks and to keep the tons of supplies and materials flowing to the builders. Clearly, the most important material was stone, and chapters generally bought or started their own quarries. It was extremely difficult and expensive carting stone, so quarries were located as close to the worksite as was possible. Another crucial and expensive item was timber, especially the long, heavy beams required for the roof. But by the end of the 13th century, there weren't many trees left in northern France that could meet these requirements, so most of the wood had to be shipped in from other countries. Many of the building trades are proudly displayed in the stained glass and carvings. All in all, building a cathedral was a tremendously expensive, time-consuming, and intricate process. In fact, it still is. 43 individual trades are represented in the stained glass at Chartres, showing not only the integration of secular and religious life in the Middle Ages, but the tremendous pride in craftsmanship that had its prime showcase in the cathedral.
If you think about it, the Gothic cathedral, or any church for that matter, was essentially built as a stage for the Mass, the greatest drama in Christian faith, the mystical play in which worshippers reenact the key event of the Last Supper and seek their own salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus. The scale of that stage may be the single thing that sets the cathedral apart. As physical setting for the Mass, the Gothic cathedral is truly awesome.
Your eyes immediately travel heavenward, and you're instantly surrounded by the mystique and the promise of supernatural power. But even aside from that, you feel the presence as soon as you enter this building. There is, first of all, the light of divine illumination. The images seem to float above us in the air. That isn't just glass. That's drama. It's also an important teaching device. Keep in mind that in the Middle Ages, outside the clergy, not many people could read or write. So the cathedrals were planned to help ordinary men and women understand and appreciate their faith. Outside in stone, inside in stone and wood and glass, the cathedral is a three-dimensional picture book of religious instruction and a guide along the pathway to salvation.
The cathedral reaffirmed for every pilgrim that his faith was real. It placed Christian belief safely out of the reach of uncertainty, making that belief as substantial and soaring as the cathedral itself.
Cathedral art also strove to constantly link religious and secular life, to glorify kings and princes along with apostles and saints. The saints, apostles, heroes and martyrs are portrayed as human, sensitive and loving, and none more so than Mary herself. Most of the prominent cathedrals of this period are dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. In an age of chivalry and exalted womanhood, it is as if an entire society had fallen in love. Mary is perceived as the Mother of God and as the human vessel through which God became flesh. She's therefore both of heaven and of earth, just like the cathedrals that bear her name.
So for all its structural brilliance and artistic splendor, the story of the building of a Gothic cathedral, like Chartres, where we began, is primarily one of faith. Faith in man's willingness to struggle and his ability to triumph, as well as faith in God to provide. In a world of temptation and uncertainty, the cathedral was an inspirational and permanent reminder of all that medieval man valued most. Its size and splendor assured and reassured the promise of eternal life in God's heavenly kingdom when the trials of life on earth came to an end.